Ladies and gentlemen, honourable members, good morning and welcome to this conference by the ECR Group. What future for EU finances? Well, I was driving to the Parliament this morning and a song by ABBA came on the radio, and our honourable member from Sweden, Mr. Eriksson, will no doubt be familiar with ABBA, but one of the lines in this song, it's called Money, 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 which I think is very appropriate. And one of the lines was, and still there never seems to be a single penny left for me. Now, the first thing I thought of was that ABBA obviously also had teenage children. But I also thought of it in the context of our discussion today, because the budget is under pressure like never before. Everybody wants to have their priorities funded adequately and more so. And yet also, ordinary citizens, the citizens that elect the members of this House and this group, are also feeling the pressure. There doesn't seem to be enough money for them to make it to the end of the month for so many millions of Europeans. So there is this duopoly within this debate, this dichotomy, if I can, where we have the interests of governments and member states, and we have interests of the ordinary people that elect our members. And I'm very pleased to welcome, first of all, to speak to us, one of the co-chairs of the ECR Group, Nicola Procaccini.
Thank you, Stephen. Good morning to everybody. Good morning, colleagues. Thank you to our panelists, but let me say especially thank you, Bogdan, for arranging this conference, important issue. Before I start in English, but is there the Italian translation? Yes. So maybe if you allow me, I prefer to speak in Italian. Quindi, buongiorno.
Good morning, and thank you very much for being here. My agenda today is rather chaotic, and I'd like to apologize in advance because I might have to leave early to get a plane to Rome. I have urgent commitments there. But I wanted to greet everybody today and say how happy I am to be here, and to thank Bogdan for organising the conference, first of all, and for all the work he does on behalf of the group on a daily basis on a subject which might appear not to be political, but is actually very political, namely the budget, European finances. That's perhaps the most political subject that exists. As you know, the Commission's proposal is for a budget of more than 2,000 billion euros. With clear political contents, political objectives. As you know, during this legislature, we've seen a trend towards setting up a sort of European superstate. And obviously, such a superstate needs a super budget if it is to develop its functions. We oppose such a European super budget because we oppose a European super state. We support the idea that was at the basis of the European Union at the outset, namely not a super state, but rather a confederation of nation states, choosing to join an alliance in order to do a limited number of things, important things, of course, but not everything. A limited number of important things. That's the key difference. Now, on my trip here this morning, I was press. There was an excellent article quoted there on how the European Union wastes taxpayers' money funding a huge number of small, useless projects. There was a good example this morning of a project funded in Italy worth 60,000 euros. And the aim of the project was to teach Roma to play tennis. That's not what the European Union was created for, to teach tennis to part of the population. No, the European Union was set up to deal with a small number of important questions. For example, protecting our borders from mass immigration, for example, developing an internal market for a population of 500 million people, enabling this population to exchange goods, to exchange products. That's one of the good reasons why we have the European Union. But it's not there to teach people how to play tennis. That shouldn't be funded with European taxpayers' money. That was a bit of a joke, but it gives an idea of the task ahead of us in the ECR. Our task now is to defend the founding idea of the European Union, namely a confederation of states, which means that the European budget should be a minimal budget covering the essentials. It shouldn't be a super budget. And we oppose the idea of having a super budget funded through national contributions, but not only through new own resources, new taxes, in other words, European taxes. That's crazy. And in particular, as has been proposed, it would be crazy for a tax on European enterprises to be introduced. There's a proposal, as you know, to tax companies with turnover of over 100 million euros. So we're talking about medium-sized enterprises, not multinationals. These are medium-sized companies in a global market. This goes against the objective for this legislature of promoting competitiveness. Fortunately, this legislature, after the green excesses of the last, has set as a key objective competitiveness. You know, this proposal goes against that. We can't try and increase competitiveness by taxing companies that are trying to compete on a global market. Thank you to Bogdan for giving us an opportunity to discuss this subject today. It's the overarching subject that covers everything else, after all. It's a question of how European citizens' money is spent. And by looking at that, we determine the sort of Europe that we wish to see. We'd like to see a different type of Europe, going back to its origins, namely an alliance of sovereign member states who have got together to do a few major things well and not teaching people how to play tennis. Thank you very much, everybody, and I do apologise for having to leave.
Bogdan, thank you very much for this event. Sorry and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. And as some of you will know, my love of puns in English brings me to pointing out that the issue that Nicola raised about tennis is simply a racket. And on the note of interpretation, apologies to interpreters for my pun.
The number one player now is Italian.
Well, indeed. Indeed.
Number one, number two, come on, Diego.
Yes, the international rivalry in the ECR group never ceases, despite our common approach to questions such as the multi-annual financial framework. Now, just as a point of housekeeping, we do have interpretation for you today in English, French, Polish, Romanian, and Italian. I'd like at this point just briefly to recognise the contribution of Nicola's fellow co-chair, Patrick Jaki, to this debate. Patrick can't be here today, and also to welcome the new Secretary General of the ECR Group, Ambassador Thomas Tchaikovsky. Welcome. Now, Nicola mentioned the role of the European Commission in this process. We'll be hearing from the European Commission very shortly. And Nicola also mentioned the foundations of the European Union, but let's also think about the foundations of the ECR political family. And if you look at the Prague Declaration, the themes of accountability and efficiency and transparency and closeness to citizens run through that document very clearly. So on that note, I'd like to welcome the inspiration behind today's meeting, Bogdan Wrząsa, to speak, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, my dear Chair Nicola, for your support. Mr. Jaki also, Mr. General Secretary also, thank you so much. As the time is limited, I would like to say that my group, our group, ECR, still believes in the EU project, which is a joint project for 27 countries. Now is a crucial time to prepare for the new budget for 2028-2033. 33. We should hold a transparent discussion and clearly ask the three EU institutions what is the best for the 27 countries. On the one hand, questions are increasingly being raised about new taxes and new burdens for EU citizens. On the other, about what will happen to the EU debt. Who will repay the current debt? Very interestingly, that European Commission has prepared a new proposal for the new debt. And record that the EU current debt is 700 billion under national recovery plan, 150 billion under the SAFE program, and 90 billion to Ukraine. If this isn't a financial nightmare, it is an uncomfortable situation. My final comment concerns the EU's euphoric assurance that everything is fine. From time to time we can hear it, everything is fine, and the alarmist assessment of economists who point to a loss of EU competitiveness vis-à-vis China and US. Where are we now? Is the first question. What needs to be done to strengthen the European Union project? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wrząsa. Now, we'll move briefly to somebody who finds himself very much in the line of fire when it comes to the next MFF. It's somebody that the ECR group knows very well, as he used to be a co-chair of this group, Executive Vice President of the European Commission, for Cohesion and Reforms, Mr. Raffaele Fitto. We have a video message from him.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm sorry I'm not able to join you in person today. I'm pleased to contribute to your reflection on the future of the European Union and in particular on its resources and budget. As you know, following the Commission's proposal of July 2025, we are now fully engaged in the core of the debate. The ongoing exchanges between the European Parliament, the Commission and the Council are helping to shape and define the architecture and the rules that will govern the next multi-annual financial framework. The Commission's proposal sets out a clear direction, a necessary direction, because it builds on the lessons learned from past experience. In a context that is increasingly complex and, above all, changing rapidly, the European budget must be guided by two fundamental principles: flexibility and simplification. Flexibility is essential because it would be unrealistic to ask member states today to operate within a legal and financial framework that remains unchanged for 7 years, regardless of evolving needs, crises or priorities. Simplification is equally crucial. Access to funding, its management, and the ability to create synergies between different policies must become more efficient. This is also one of the strongest messages we receive from territories, regions, and local actors across Europe. At the same time, we are firmly committed to preserving the core values of European policies, a strong territorial approach, solutions tailored to the specific characteristics of different places, and attention to the diversity of territories, from cities to rural areas, from coastal zones to more remote regions. A modern European budget must be both agile and grounded in the realities on the ground. Only in this way can it respond effectively to citizens' expectations and support development across the Union. This is how we can build a stronger Europe with more resilient territories that are not only able to respond to challenges and difficulties, but also capable of actively shaping and influencing their own development. I wish you a productive and constructive discussion, and I look forward to the outcomes of your debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to the team of Vice President Fitto for providing that video. So we move on to the first panel, Shaping the EU Budget for Tomorrow, Priorities and Accountability. And in true European fashion, we have voices from North and South and all over, from net contributors to net recipients of the budget, to give different perspectives on how the next MFF should look, what should be in it, what it should prioritise. And I just hang a thought out there that we're faced with crises that we hear about every day, the climate crisis and the security crisis. But as Mr. Johnson was saying, do we necessarily see certain aspects of other policies, such as competitiveness, as a crisis that Europe is facing? Do we take it seriously enough? Are our leaders really recognising that this is a serious issue? So with that, let me welcome our guests. First of all, on my left, Mojmir Hampel, a former Vice Governor and Board Member of the Czech National Bank. We have Adriaan Schout from the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And we have also Daniel Lacalle from Spain, from Alpha Strategy Consulting. So I'm looking forward to a vigorous discussion, hopefully to open it up to the floor after our speakers have given their contributions. So first, to you, Mojmir, for a perspective from the Czech Republic.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and many thanks to the ECR Group for a kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here after some time, and a special pleasure for me to see so many young faces, students, young people here in the room. That's brilliant. Let me start by saying that I'm pretty sure that the environment for Europe has been changing dramatically ever since the times of the COVID. look what we have been losing ever since 2022. Cheap energy from Russia, cheap defense umbrella from the US, the depth and the speed of globalization. And as of 2025, I think that we have been losing also Germany as the ultimate safeguard against over-indebtedness of the whole club that we call the EU. These are dramatically changed circumstances for the project and for the way how we raise the money, how we spend the money. And this means quite a lot. It is true that in terms of the general government debt in the EU as a whole, we were going down, not in all the countries, but on average in the EU. But the debt of EU institutions have been rising and is set to rise also in the years to come. It has been mentioned already. I'm not sure whether everybody is aware of the nice nuance of the EU debt. The EU debt as a whole, once created, is not ascribed to individual member states. That's why it's so attractive. So it doesn't increase the debt burden of individual member states. It remains as a debt of the whole club, but doesn't increase the numbers that the Eurostat then reports for individual countries. What is interesting, and this is the environment where we are living in, is that even at in the times of the COVID, at the end of the COVID times, the developed world had the general government debt against the GDP at the level seen last at the end of the Second World War. But right now, with all the relevant predictions that we have, and the relevant prediction from the IMF, until the end of this decade, the developed world will have the debt against the GDP unseen from the end of the Napoleonic Wars. So the highest that we have got on record. This is the environment. This is the world we are living in. We will be financing our new priorities, our new debts, definitely with higher yields, higher interest rates. There is a general belief of the markets that the inflation will not be as low as it was during the times of great moderation, and the yields, interest rates, the costs of debt will be higher, and they are still going up in the developed world. So we will finance everything once we create a new debt with a higher cost of capital, sort of. And this is something that we should bear in mind. This is something that I like to point out. I'm sure that the good old days when we were spending so low amounts of money on defense are long gone and will not return for the EU. It's quite clear. Look at this chart, which shows that we in Europe were really, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1990, we were spending on many other priorities, but not defense. Look at the chart. And we will not go back to these good old days. Unfortunately, and this is something that I have to say in my current capacity as the head of the independent fiscal institution called the Czech Fiscal Council, which is a barking institution which barks and quite often nobody listens. Whenever we in Europe have got new priorities, we have got a tendency to add these new priorities as new layers to the existing ones. We are not making hard choices between the existing and new ones. We simply add new priorities, new costly priorities to the existing ones. And what I want to show, and this is where the charts are directing you, even in the very rich Europe, we are unable to finance all these new priorities together with the existing ones. It's not financeable. We economists sometimes tend to say that you have to have a choice whether butter or weapons. We in Europe, when faced with this challenge, we say we want both, butter and weapons. And this is the biggest problem that we are facing. And I have to say that in many capitals in the EU, we are still not capable of addressing it and accepting it as the cruel reality of budget constraints that we have. I've got so many other nice charts. I do not want to spend so much time on them. Maybe we will get to some of them. I just want to say that one of the costly priorities that we still have in the EU is a relatively costly decarbonization. You know? This priority, this statutory priority of the EU, is not equally costly for all the countries in the EU. I'm coming from Central and Eastern Europe, from a country where the proportion of the industrial output on the GDP is higher than is the average of the EU. And for us, for instance, the public money needed to spend on decarbonization in our region are higher than in the Western Europe. This is the reality, and it needs to be taken into account. And it will explain to you why in some discussions there are different positions from different countries, different angles of the EU. But we have got this priority, we want to finance it, but if we want to finance it, then we will have to sacrifice something. This is how the budget is becoming more and more complex, the EU budget. You know it better than me. I'm not, in that much of a detail, but I'm sure that it will be even more complex in the next period. And so far, you know that we have been, and it has been said, financing the priorities with the new common debt. And I know that many of you here in this group have got a lot of reservations against this development. I think these are right questions, right reservations, and right things to be debated in the months to come. I know it will be a tough debate, maybe more complicated than ever before when preparing the next budget. But I think this is the time when the questions that I've raised should be debated and should be debated properly. Maybe this is the last time when we can debate it without the complete meltdown of the financial environment of the EU. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Moimir. Just a question for you. Wearing your central banker's hat, what really keeps you awake at night in terms of macroeconomic risk, not just economic but also political, when you have your central banker's hat on, when you look at this MFF?
The inconsistency between the inability of European economies to grow substantially, to have not just the growth of the GDP, but the growth of productivity, as in the past, and the inconsistency of this macro picture with the ever-increasing demands on financing, both on the private and the public sector. This inconsistency is something that really worries me.
Great, thank you very much, Moimir. And I'm going to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions to all our panelists a little bit later. But let me come now to Adriaan Schout from the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, a country that is renowned for its emphasis on fiscal discipline, by and large, when it comes at least to the European context, but also a country that has a complex domestic political environment with different coalition governments that come and go, and various priorities and balances that need to be made in those coalition governments. I don't want to get into the politics because I know that your institute takes a very neutral and non-political view. But I'd be very keen to hear a little bit about your experience in the Netherlands specifically. So, Adriaan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you also for inviting me, because in fact I'm going to talk about something which is not often discussed when it comes to the EU budget, and it may be regarded as highly technical. Actually, I sit here with my hat on from the think tank, Klingendahl Institute in the Netherlands, with the official think tank, and we're independent. And I just wrote a policy paper called, with the title, it's a policy paper with the title, the MFF proposal from the Commission, caught between ambitions and governance failure. So I'm going to talk about the governance side, or that's what I'm looking at, and that's regarded as technical. But in fact, the governance side is about the rules of how do you plan and spend and monitor and control the budget, and that is in fact highly political. And when I say the title is something with ambitions and governance failure, you can immediately see that we need reforms, and that is always very political. It's about the rules of the game. And maybe this is typically Dutch, because in essence the Dutch are very pro-European, and they might not mind if the EU budget increases, or if it contains integration by stealth or whatever, as long as we know that it's well spent and transparent and all the rest of it. So maybe it's very Dutch. It's not a very popular thing to discuss, because people like to talk about the size of the budget and priorities. This is about the governance. Now, in the private sector, when something doesn't work, or when you change a strategy, in the private sector, they're immediately going to look at what is the structure of the organization, strategy and structure, and we all learn it at universities. In the EU, we don't do it, or in public administration. When something doesn't work, we ask for more policies, or change policies. We very seldom look at the system behind it. And now really is the time, in the run-up to the next MFF, to actually look critically at how money is spent, monitored, etc. So strategy and structure. There are two kinds of problems with the MFF. First is the current MFF. Actually, we know already for 30 years that we have serious problems with the spending of the MFF. There are many ECHA reports, the European Court of Auditors, that highlight things, the high fault margins in spending, but also the problems with performance pay, problems with the transparency, the efficiency, the effectiveness. ECHA has been documented that for years. And when you look at cohesion policy, we're tinkering for maybe 30 years or more with how can we improve the spending of cohesion policy. And in fact, we haven't achieved this. So we really need to think harder about how do we actually use and spend the money. The RRF, I was already afraid of it when it was accepted, which is performance-based. And we already heard this morning a couple of examples. Probably the RRF has major problems with actually the legitimacy in that sense of has it been effective and efficient and transparent, etc. So the current budget is already a problem. The second problem I see is when you look at the MFF proposals from the European Commission, and already we also heard the terms from the Vice President this morning about flexibility and simplification, and being close to the regions in the member states. Actually, simplification, from my perspective, from governance perspective, is extremely hard to do. So what is called simplification is in fact highly challenging. If you want to make the budget more flexible and simplified, you need to have indicators. Now, indicators are, again, very difficult, because what indicators do you use? How do you use indicators? Because first of all, you need benchmarks in the member states. Then also you need to have a system that can actually monitor what has been achieved. And that needs to be done in a transparent way and in an independent way. So you need systems that are transparent, independent, and close to the regions and the member states. Now, if you look at the Commission and the current problems, we see that the transparency of the way the budget is assessed and evaluated, we do have serious problems. We also see that there are doubts about the independence, about how the monitoring of the current spending functions. We already see that when we look at the fault margins and the report for the European Court of Auditors. The member states report to the Commission finds mistakes in the spending, which is normal, of course. But it also indicates, well, something goes wrong in the member states. But then the European Court of Auditors does the annual reviews and the multi-annual reviews of the fault margins, and it finds again that the Commission estimates of fault margins are too low. So also the Commission has a problem. Now that's just the fault margins. But when you look, for example, when it comes to effectiveness, there's very little effectiveness studies done on spending of the EU budget. So we need to look more carefully into that. And when it comes to, for example, the proposals from the Commission on performance pay, funding not linked to costs, it's called, but it used to be called performance pay. And you look at the previous experiments with that and the European Court of Auditors reports on that, you can see that very little money has actually been withheld to member states. So funding not linked to cost, performance pay, actually resulted in almost always paying out the budget. So, well, I can go on and on about the current difficulties in the budget and the proposals from the Commission of how this simplification and flexibility is going to be extremely difficult. The bottom line is we need more hands-on systems in the member states. We need more independent in the monitoring and the enforcement of the payments, and we need more transparency. Now, the good news is when I look at the EU, there are European policy sectors that have been working extremely well. European competition policies is one of the examples, but we can look at food safety and many other EU sectors actually work really well. The good news is it can be done. But the bad news is that some sectors actually do not work very well, and that's the semester and also the MFF, the spending. These are areas that do not work very well. Now, for me, coming from sort of private sector organizational theory, we need to learn in the EU from why are some sectors doing well and other sectors are not performing well, like the budget and the Stability and Growth Pact. Actually, the highly sensitive areas do not work very well when it's about money. So to conclude, because I can go into many details here, one conclusion is we have to debate, well, but I can put it as a hypothesis, we have a management deficit, a government deficit when it comes to the EU budget. Fine, ask for more money, whatever, have debts, whatever, but we need to address it and it needs to be solved. That's part of the core legitimacy that you need to have. The second thing is we need to have a different administrative culture, and I can summarize it by I would suggest to take all parts of the management of the EU budget out of the Commission and put it in independent agencies. The second thing is keep the European agencies related to the budget very small, as it happens in the successful other areas, and rely more on national institutions and ensure that they are independent and transparent. Basically, it's very simple what I'm saying. The EU should rely on subsidiarity-based first line of the management and monitoring are the member states. And the second line is the European level of assessing the quality of the national institutions. That's a subsidiarity-based system. It works in other areas, but we do not apply it in EU spending because the European Commission is really hands-on. The same applies to the European Court of Auditors, a fabulous institution, but it cannot monitor all this spending in terms of legality and effectiveness. You need to work through the national supreme audit institutions. So there are constructive suggestions to be made and to consider, but I'm afraid that this is about reform and changing organizational structures and practices. From my discussions I've had at the EU level, I can see that this is extremely sensitive. The Commission would not be very happy about any agency discussion and carving out tasks from the Commission. The European Court of Auditors won't be happy to address these issues either, but the member states won't be happy with this kind of proposal that I make, because actually the member states also have a benefit when the system is not very transparent, and that you can have politicized dialogues with the Commission about, if you look at that indicator and less at that indicator, you can still give me the money. So, but that's the way we get stuck in all these complaints about the effectiveness and efficiency and legality of the budget. So the bad news is there's a governance deficit, and we have to face it when discussing the next MFF proposal. The good news is, well, there are systems in the EU that work well from which we can draw lessons if only there's a willingness to reform. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. And just briefly, I want to acknowledge the presence of our member from the Netherlands, Bert-Jan Roysen, our chief whip in the ECR group. Just as a follow-up, Adrian, this issue of conditionality, which is quite interesting, we've seen on questions of the rule of law, for example, that it has been suggested that certain aspects of European financing should be held back from countries if they do not meet certain rule of law standards. Is there any room, do you think, for suggesting that there should be conditionality in terms of performance-related criteria? You talked about the difficulty of benchmarks. Yeah. Do you think this is a viable option to develop in the subsequent MFF, this idea of conditionality?
Well, yes, I think it is. But here again, I would really look at the debates that are at the national level, because you have to start at where the national level, the debates are, and the qualities and the capacities. And I think you also have to look very carefully about what the national preferences are and whether they are feasible. For example, in the Netherlands, which I know, of course, best here, is that actually our finances are pretty sound. And if we then get political suggestions for reform, we're in a system where actually we think we're doing reasonably well, like our pensions are probably, probably the best in the EU or maybe the world, and we are thinking about it, but leave it to us, why would you do it here? So you have to be very careful that it fits in a way that it is very clear that from a European perspective, you really have to do that. And sometimes it is done on the basis of, well, we at the EU level have to give you a reform example. But the rule of law, I want to stay out, because sometimes rule of law issues are highly normative. And that's an area that I want. But in any case, rely very closely on the national systems and the choices, and that the overall structure is a sound system. So it can be done, but not from a centralized level. You need to work subsidiarity based.
Thank you, Adrian. Important echoes from the first page of the treaty: subsidiarity and proportionality. Exactly. Now we come to our third panelist on this first panel, looking ahead to the MFF. For the next 7-year programming period, Daniel Lacalle. And he's an economist and fund strategist who's known internationally for his work on market-led growth and efficient public spending, just the kind of thing we like to hear in the ECR group. So, Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. In 2021, The Economist ran a cover that said, "The Triumph of Big Government." In 2025, the cover said, "The Coming Debt Emergency." We have a very significant problem when we look at European financial systems and the European financial situation, which is to look at the current picture as a photograph, because we're not looking at the challenges ahead. The challenges ahead are very significant. If we look at the committed but not financed liabilities of the euro area, we see that Spain has 500% of GDP, France has about 400% of GDP, Germany has about 300% of GDP. Those are liabilities that have already been committed and have not been financed. That is future debt, okay? If we add to that the demographic, technological, energy, and financial challenge that the European Union faces, all of those together show that we need to be exceedingly prudent about the fiscal position of the European Union. When we look at all of the messages that I read today and in the past 2 days, the information that we have been provided, there are two words that scare me quite a bit. Now, number one, small. I hear that the budget is very small. Relative to what? Relative to nominal GDP. Okay, what is nominal GDP? GDP including inflation. Be very careful about measures, as my esteemed colleague must know, about measures relative to nominal GDP because you get accustomed to making people poorer. Furthermore, manageable. No, it is not manageable. No, it is not manageable because in this debate, very few times I hear that the euro and the US dollar have stopped being the world reserve currencies in central banks, i.e. gold has overtaken the euro and the dollar. What does that mean? It means that the alleged safe asset, which is European debt, European member states' debt, is not a safe asset anymore, as we have seen when the European Central Bank or the Federal Reserve cuts rates, yet government bond yields don't go down. That is, all those emergency elements are things that should be taken into account because what tends to happen in the European Union is that we only acknowledge them when they come back to bite us. We only acknowledge the problems, the financial problems, once they have happened, not once they have happened this week, once they have happened this past year. So the elements that we need to take into account are first, what kind of return are these budgets providing? I have found it impossible in my professional experience to find any analysis, any thorough analysis of the returns generated by the Juncker plan, by the Next Generation EU, or by the Job and Growth Plan of 2009. Nothing. We spend and it happens. We need to acknowledge that we have two strengths. The European Union is a tremendous strength. This is a political absolute victory. And we have the euro. The euro is the biggest monetary success in history. Anyone that lived its beginnings must acknowledge that very few people had any faith in it. Those two things are not given by God. They're given because there is a perception globally of fiscal prudence and of positive management of budgets, i.e. what my esteemed colleague was mentioning, there is always somebody controlling others from leading to the inevitable excesses that can happen. We need to spend more in defense. We need to spend more in healthcare. And we need to spend a lot more in technology. Those things are going to come back in the future with much more strains on public budgets. And we cannot take more taxes. We cannot expect the world to see the European Union as an opportunity for investment, an opportunity for growth, when the word competitiveness comes in messages, yet you're basically subsidizing low competitiveness and penalizing high competitiveness. That never works, no? So we need to pay attention to these committed unfinanced liabilities. We need to pay attention to the tax burden that is being imposed on our companies, because China, India, and the United States are not going to follow our path. They're not. We need to compete in a global world in which we have three strengths: the financial sector, the rule of law, and the economic freedom. Those are the ones that we need to protect. But we must remember that financial crises don't happen because of small elements like the tech bubble or the subprime bubble. They happen because there's suddenly an immediate burst of lack of confidence in sovereign debt. So there's going to be a lot more issuance of debt in the next 3 years. In 2026, the European Union member states and the European Commission are going to be the largest, after China, issuers of new debt in the world. Therefore, what we need to do is simply remind the world why we are something that needs to be seen as a low-risk asset. And the only way to do it is by having accountability, transparency, and understanding that central planning doesn't work and that centralizing more doesn't make anything better, it makes everything worse. That's basically what we need to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Question for you. The great Margaret Thatcher said one of her mantras was "People respond to incentives," which will be something that a lot of economists consider in their research. How can the MFF incentivize reform? Does it have the capacity at the moment? How could it have that capacity? Because you might argue that one way of making things work better is actually to provide less to drive innovation, to drive reform, to drive new perspectives.
Yeah. Lady Thatcher was right, both in that sentence and also in the one that there's no such thing as public money, but taxpayer money. So I think that what we need to have is a system of incentives and disincentives. So it's not just about providing a framework that is going to help countries have some funds in order to achieve those elements of reform, but also disincentives. Because it is exceedingly frustrating when I read the European Commission reports on countries like mine, like Spain, in which they basically say, oh, well, yeah, you haven't done any of the things that we recommended. However, we're going to give you 70 billion euro more, in case you forgot. There needs to be a disincentive element that does not make the European Union a minimum common denominator team, but a maximum common nominator team, i.e., in which everybody is basically acting to provide the best for the common good in order to grow more, to generate more competitiveness and to attract more investments, instead of believing that somebody else is going to pay for it. I always say that with the credit card of others, every restaurant is cheap. So we need to be aware that we don't have the credit card of others. We have the credit card of the credibility of the European Union, and that is at stake.
And do we have the credit card of our younger generation? That's the interesting thing to ask, given that we have a number of students in the audience, young people, and I'm particularly keen for them to get involved in our question and answer session to this first panel, because this budget sets the tone for the next 7 years. And we've seen that there are some priorities for young people in terms of mobility and education in there. But this younger generation, as has been pointed out, with regard to the impact and consequences of the COVID pandemic, has been particularly disadvantaged. So with that, I'd like to open the floor both to those here in the room and to those online for questions and comments to our panellists. And maybe our panellists even want to take issue with what each other has said today up here. So please, if anyone has any questions or comments, we'd like to hear them. If you could just explain where you are from, what your organization is. Okay. We have somebody right at the back, please. Right at the back first.
Right. Can you hear me? Yeah, this is Jacob from Euractiv. So I wonder if you can get a bit more concrete. So now we have, in the Commission's proposal, it's something like half the budget goes to cap and cohesion. You have some 409 billion for research and innovation. Then you have, 170 billion to pay back the COVID loan, so it's not really part of the expenditure. And then you have 200 billion a foreign policy fund, basically. So, I mean, there's been said a lot of things about wasting money, I'm a bit curious, how would you change this distribution if you could decide where the money goes?
Let's take that question first up. Who would like to comment on that? Moimir, would you like to say something on that?
Yep. Exactly. Be more specific. That's a fair point. I touched upon some of the issues, so maybe I will be even more specific. You are absolutely right that the big question is the repayment of the Next Gen EU loan, which should consume something like 8 to 10% of the whole budget. And the big question for you policymakers is whether just to roll it over or to start repay this as it was meant. A big issue and big question. Maybe we can touch upon that a bit later. But if you ask me as a citizen, where I believe you should start asking the questions about priorities, I know that it will be absolutely unpopular, but I believe that we are unable to finance the cohesion in the amounts that we were used to in the past if we want to spend on new priorities that we discussed. I'm not sure that we are capable of spending so much on agriculture in the next financial framework. Again, very unpopular. And as I said, I think we should reconsider the amount of money, and you have seen that in the charts that we spend on the way how we decarbonize in the EU. These are the issues that I would, at least at the very beginning, start opening up.
Okay, Adrian, you wanted to say something as well?
Yeah, I'm going to be very technocratic in my answer. I think the first thing that we should do is actually to get the national auditing institutions, the national supreme auditing institutions, to produce reports, independent reports as they are supposed to present, about what the funds that we now have been delivering and whether they have been effective. I would like to see reports on the effectiveness, because this is how you should decide on policies. What has been delivered? Has it been worth it? And that is what the national supreme audit institutions in the member states generally do with national policies and spending. So let them do it also with the EU spending. And then we know more whether regional funds or agriculture or R&D has been spent usefully. I would also like to see national studies on what has been done with the RRF. Before we dive into new experiments with things that build on the RRF, let's actually evaluate it and let the National Supreme Audit Institution do that, because they are supposed to do that again for that kind of work for national spending. So the first thing I would say, and that's why I dodge maybe for the question of what should be the priorities, is what do we know about in an independent and transparent way about how it has been spent and what have been the results. So that's where I would start.
Thank you, Adrian. In fact, this issue of Next Generation EU is something of the elephant in the room with regard to the financing of the next MFF. And I wonder whether these kind of temporary crisis management tools are going to become a permanent feature in the landscape of the financing of the EU over time. But with that, I'll pass the floor to Daniel, because I know you wanted to say something on this question as well.
Two things, particularly because also remember the concept of incentives and disincentives. If you're going to pay back the COVID loans with an increase in taxes on businesses, it's going to be hugely detrimental to both the perception of whether these emergency measures are actually emergency or just something that has become the norm. Cohesion. The European Union should not be spending that kind of amount on cohesion. It's very simple. and everybody should understand it right now with the level of also understanding that the interesting thing about the question is how you bring such an enormous budget to 4 items. No, it's disaggregation as well. You need to look at every single item. And most of the expenditure that can be revised is actually items that people say it's peanuts. You know what happens with peanuts is that taxpayers pay for them. And the other problem that I have is with research and development. Why does the budget have to finance research and development out of spending? Give tax credits. It doesn't make any sense that the European Union as a whole is one of the economic regions that spends more on research and development, yet has a very limited number of patents relative to GDP. So basically, when you spend on research and development, I know a very interesting study that was financed with these funds, which was about the use of the bicycle in Sevilla. When you spend it on things like that, and knowing that 75% of that research and development is for climate change, you're going to have a big problem. You're going to have a big problem in innovation, and remember that out of the 4 crisis elements that I outlined for the European Union and the world in the next 5 years, one of them is technology.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Some more questions. Mr. Piperia.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know whether or not we do have translation from Romanian to English, because I have one comment and it's a little more complicated, and also I have a question. Okay, bon. Comentariul.
So my comment, my observation. The European Court of Accounts very recently, in October if I'm not wrong, in 2025, published a report saying that the total of the EU debt is about 570 to 600 billion euro, and by the end of 2027 we will have to repay 900 billion, close to 1,000 billion euro. I can't understand how such an amount can be repaid without suffocating the EU. It was said here that it is fairly easy to repay this debt because the EU GDP is very large, like 30 trillion euro. But I think this is not correct or even false, because we are talking about the internal GDP of all the 27 member states combined. We are not talking about the EU GDP, which so far is not a state or a federation. If we are talking about the combined GDP of 27 member states, we should add this MFF with all the budgets of the member states, and then we would see this debt is not so sustainable, and the debt increases. I think the estimate by the Court of Accounts is optimistic because last year, among other things, the European rearmament program was launched, and this is still being challenged on legality before the court, and it was not ECR that did this, but the President of the European Parliament, Mrs. Metsola, challenged it. This was my comment. My question is even more difficult. We are talking about Next Generation EU, and this program was launched with the aim of overcoming the difficulties of the pandemic time. But it was a sort of parallel budget, even a parasite budget of the EU. The MFF was 22 trillion euro, the previous MFF. Next Generation EU is about 57 additional billion, and it burdened the EU, although it is there is no legal entity that can have such a budget. The budget of the EU is the budget of the European Commission. So we have this budget of Next Generation EU that should be repaid soon in 2027, and it amounts to 470 billion euro. And this is not just a problem of repaying EU debt. There is a sensitive legality issue. The Court of Accounts noticed this not last year, but in 2023 already. So my question is, how will we overcome this legality issue and also the financing of the debt issue? This issue is increasing. And I mention again, we are still an alliance of states, a confederation, but not a state. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pipere. Would any of our panelists like to make any specific observations about what Mr. Pipere was saying?
Just one. I think it's absolutely staggering to read that 9 out of 10 euros of the Next Generation EU fund have gone to state-owned companies. That is the most ridiculous use of European money that could have ever existed. I think that it's also very, very important what you just outlined, is that we keep talking about small debt on top of already existing debt. So we talk about debt to GDP without understanding that that GDP includes the debt of the private sector, the debt of families, and the debt of the member states. Furthermore, one of the things that very few people talk about in the financial world is the total debt of public administrations, because the European Union talks about, and the European central banks talks about the level of debt under the protocol of excessive deficit. The difference, for example, in the case of Spain between the protocol of excessive deficit debt and the issued debt is 500 billion. You know? So we're hiding debt under the rug, thinking that nothing is going to happen just because it didn't happen. And then one day, when it happens, we blame the markets, we blame me.
Yeah, fund managers always get it in the neck, don't they? Moimir, over to you.
Yes. I cannot address the issue of legality or the legal issues of the common debt, but there are financing issues, definitely. Actually, when and you said that, it's an elephant in the room. That's absolutely clear. Sometimes it's better not to start flirting with some ideas, because then you have got no idea how to get out of it later on. And this is where we are. This is what we pointed out when the Next Gen EU emerged, because at that point it was clear that in 2027 and 2028 we will not be able to answer the question how to continue. And the easiest way how to overcome the difficulties always is to roll it over once you start it, to continue and to expand. So the biggest political issue right now is whether to stop it, but it means start repaying. It means decreasing the amount of money available for everything else, and to close it forever and not to start over again, or to roll it over and then open the gates for using this kind of financing ever after with ever increasing amount. This is the political choice which was created by the very fact that we started with this idea of a common debt. You are absolutely right about the findings of the European Court of Auditors about the common debt. And again, there is one more small nuance regarding the common debt. Unlike in member countries, when the European Commission increases the debt, it increases the debt without increasing the deficit in the very first instance. in every member country, according to Eurostat rules, to get to the deficit, to get to the debt, you first have to have a deficit. Commission cannot have a deficit. It has to be a balanced budget. So unlike in the member countries that it is supervising, having a deficit in the first place, which is something quite unusual and a nuance that many people are not aware of. And once the people start asking the questions why the rules are applicable to national states and not the Commission itself, then maybe it will be very hard to respond to these questions. And this is what the European Court of Auditors did.
Yeah, thanks, Moimir. Arkadiusz Milaszek, you wanted to say something.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this very interesting presentation discussion. My question will be about the EU budget, especially on the security and military spendings. In this context of the European Union budget, how do you see the European Commission define the objectives of the Union security and defense policy? Especially, is the primary goal to strengthen Europe's collective security and effectively support Ukraine in winning the war against Russian aggression? Or is there a risk that defense spending priorities may lead to the political and industrial dominance of few member states, particularly France and Germany? How you see how we can, as a member of European Parliament, to ensure fair access to defense programs and procurement, including for partners from all European Union countries and from companies from the United States, because now they are excluded from the tenders. Today I saw the speech on the social media. U.S. Ambassador Tony Rose, he complained that the European Union exclude American companies from the European Union budget. So I think this is the open question, and I think very important question. If European Union want to really support Ukraine and want to win this war, or this is unclear aim or goal, European Union, support German and France economy, especially military companies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's an interesting question and one that obviously has a great deal of political weight attached to it. And as I mentioned at the start, we're assailed by various crises. The security and defence crisis is one that is perhaps among the most urgent. Do any of our panellists want to make any comments on that particular issue?
I don't think we should be worrying too much whether the expenditure on defense is going to benefit one member state or another member state if we think as the European Union. Because investing in defense is an exceptional tool to bring investment in technology which benefits everybody, as many countries in the European Union understand. I think that the problem is that a lot of member states are adding expenditures that have absolutely nothing to do with defense to the figure of defense in order to say that they are complying with the NATO agreements. That is a big problem. Because in some countries they're including climate change efforts as defense. Not that you cannot, that you shouldn't have some climate change efforts, but that is a dangerous thing. If we want to support Ukraine, we need to support Ukraine. We don't. It's not just say we support Ukraine.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left before I want to take a coffee break. Mrs. Zalewska, please.
Thank you. Thank you for this meeting. Thank you for this very interesting conference. My question would be as follows. I would like to ask for your comments with regard to my opinion on budgeting in the EU. I work in the ENVI Committee and the Energy Committee. I was actually one of the people who were working on the climate law. The climate law was, I think, based on miscalculations, wrong calculations. We even had legal services in the Parliament saying that. Moreover, when we started working on the climate law, COVID happened. So we knew it would not be feasible, that we have to stop with calculating the benchmarks and come back to calculation of benchmarks once COVID ends. Frans Timmermans, however, decided to announce Fit for 55. And what do we have there? Basically, more glory to the climate law, even more miscalculations or unpredictability, random objectives, and obligation to put them in place. And then after Fit for 55, we have another challenge, war in Ukraine. So I think that what represents the backbone and what draws so much attention in the European Commission, so the entire climate package, is something that is completely unfeasible. So what do we have to deal with? We have European Court of Auditors who said the same thing when they were summarizing how the financing went with this fund. And there were clear decisions from the court saying that it has not been managed appropriately. And then we had Draghi report, Letta report, and both of these texts say clearly that as a result of such actions, we've lost competitiveness. And what does the EU do? It draws absolutely no lessons from that. No decisions are taken as a result. What I'm trying to say is that in the ENVI Committee, for instance, people who have no clue about how financing works take absurd decisions. For instance, they say in what way we should implement a given environmental target and climate target. And when I say why, they say because. And then we have trilogues and maybe more credible calculations. Maybe it happens in a different way. However, our position in those trilogues mean basically automatic agreement or cutting certain things in half to make sure that we can implement them. To conclude, I think this is not feasible. It represents a burden for many member states. And most importantly, it represents a burden to all Europeans. At the same time, the EU is in breach of treaties. Again, coming back to the climate package and Fit for 55. Those two texts make reference to taxes, energy mix, all of them. So, and in the treaties, we say we need unanimity on that. What did Timmermans do? The European Commission do? They only refer to environment in their provisions, and they rejected all amendments that could potentially lead to more debate on whether or not these budgets are feasible. And really, last but not least, I think the lack of appropriate approach to finances on the part of the European Commission is all of the fluctuations when it comes to legal provisions. Again, coming back to the climate law. We all remember when we had to replace the type of heating we had, move from coal to gas. And then the heat pumps, they were introduced. And then there was another decision several months later that this now belongs to the past, is now obsolete. We have to move to propane. I can really give you even more examples, but what I'm trying to say is that the EU, I think, has enclosed itself in a certain vicious circle and takes decisions that have no rationale, no sources of financing, and then we leave it as a burden on member states and Europeans. And the burden is such that it's basically unbearable. So we have to ask ourselves a question: where is Europe going? Quo vadis Europe? And where do you really want to find money for your budgets going forward?
Thank you, Mrs. Zalewska. So the mismatch between EU budget and political priorities and the economic reality that Europeans are facing. Who would like to comment on that? Adrian.
Yes, I think it's very recognizable what you said, and it actually fits very well with my colleagues just said. It reminds me of the importance of subsidiarity, that we should get much of these debates at the national level, and that you do, for example, my colleague here is from the Fiscal Council, the IFI. Those are tiny institutions, but that's one of the ways that we have to go, actually to take the responsibilities for the decisions that we take at the European level at the national level, because so that there are highly prestigious, independent, well-regarded national bodies saying the things that you are saying about, okay, we want more of this, we want more of that, but, you know, can we all do it? Is it all worth it? And that means that we need to create and drag in the national institutions like, for example, the Supreme Order institutions, that they look at the RRF, for example, that it's not the ECHA that looks at the RRF, but that it's the national authority. What have we paid? What did we get out of it? Independent, transparent, reliable. And then the member states also are confronted with the decisions that are taken at European level, that there is no free money, etc. I'm not in any way want to say anything about the sort of budgets that the EU decides on, but you need to get very clear who pays what, is it worth it, are the statements that are being made about these plans and the results, are they reliable and transparent, or do they come from Brussels, that there is no ownership, that's an important word in this sort of thing, at the national level. So we need to really look at the boring thing, at the governance structure, so that you create the IFIs, the independent fiscal institutions, and the other bodies that you have at the national level, involve them at the European level, so that this idea of free money, lack of transparency, etc., is disappearing. And then we will more clearly see at the national level what the consequences are, both in the positive side as well as when it comes to costs and returns.
Moimir.
Yep. Well, this was more of a comment than a question, but the comment which was very much in line with what we have been discussing in the session in the morning. So first, it would be of utmost importance and interest for me to get into the details of the calculations that you have got in ENVI that you have mentioned. I think to debate these would be really important, and to have more detailed knowledge would be helpful for me, maybe for the public debate. But what's more important is what has been said. Margaret Thatcher mentioned here 2 times or 3 times today, said that, and she stressed the importance of budget constraints. That if you want to change the behavior in the public sphere, sometimes the most efficient way how to change the behavior, how to incentivize, is to set a tough budget constraint. And what we are discussing right now, in terms of the debate about the next MFF, is that right now in the EU we really do feel the budget constraint that we to some extent didn't feel in the past. And that's why all these questions are more relevant than ever, because we are going out of easy money. And that's the main point. I think the main point for the debate about the next MFF. So Margaret Thatcher is with us again.
Well, indeed. And she always likened her economic theory to the way that families and businesses and shops, I mean, she was a shopkeeper's daughter, how these basic fundamental elements of society work. I'll give the floor to you, Daniel, and then we'll round off with a coffee break.
Yes, a lot of people, a lot of economists say that the state is not like families and businesses, and that therefore we should not think of debt and financial situations in the same way. But that is only because the state lives off families and businesses. No? So one of the things that are very important about what you just outlined, Ms. Zalewska, is that there is a very big risk when we undertake enormous economic programs in which we don't take into account the cost to our businesses, to our families, to the farming, agriculture, industrial sectors, etc. And when we see that those policies were wrong, instead of changing them, we double down. That is the big risk of so many budget-driven elements, is that there is an incentive to continue spending on something even if you know that it didn't work. No? And that is a huge, huge burden, because the European Union is 9% of the global emissions, but is 100% of the cost. And we conduct policy believing that China and the United States and India are going to follow what we do. No, they don't. No, they won't. And I think that by now, we should at least acknowledge that there are better ways of dealing with the climate crisis, which is obviously through technology, through innovation, and through competitiveness, not through spending and taxes.
Thanks, Daniel. Well, we'll have plenty of time for more discussion after our second panel, which will come up after our coffee break. So please head outside and enjoy your coffee. And even the Italians among us advise me that it's still not too late in the day to have a cappuccino. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get started again. And we make a fundamental shift from looking at what the EU spends its money on, onto how the EU finds the money to pay for that. This is the question of own resources. It's a controversial question, as you will know, and Europe is entering this debate that touches on many sensitive issues, key issues for the ECR group, of sovereignty, of subsidiarity, of respect for national competences, competitiveness and fairness. And we're joined by three experts who bring different perspectives, economic, institutional and political insight into this discussion. What comes to mind is what Daniel was saying about the credit card. Yes, you can pay for things and find the money a little bit later down the line, but own resources is essentially a question of the European Union developing its own independent revenue-raising capacity, which hitherto is a right, a responsibility given to member states alone. Now, with that, I will just introduce our three panelists briefly. Jussi Lindgren from Finland, a special advisor in the government. Roald Dom from Bruegel, the well-known think tank here in Brussels, and Tomasz Groza from university, from academic circles in Poland, from the University of Warsaw. So first to Jussi Lindgren, special advisor for economic policy to the Finnish Minister of Finance. And with that, just before you start, Jussi, I want to say hello and welcome to our member from Finland, Sebastian Tinkinen. Jussi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. I hope everybody can hear me. First of all, thanks for inviting me here. Very kind of you. I'm very glad to be here. I used to live here for 3 years, actually. Back in the years, I worked for the European Commission for 3 years, so I know a little bit about the institutions as well, although I never actually visited the European Parliament for some reason. This is my first time, so it's also interesting from this point of view. I'd like to as I work for Mrs. Purra, the Finance Minister of Finland, I come from the Finns Party. In my initial points, I will tell a little bit about the official Finnish position on the MFF proposal and own resources especially. And then I will delve more into, let's say, more strategic or philosophical even issues on which way the EU is developing, because I think big issues are coming for the decision makers here in Brussels and in capitals as well. So it's a very, very important topic. On the MFF, it was pretty hard to form even a preliminary negotiating position from the point of view of the Finnish government. We have a coalition of 4 parties, and especially, first of all, the proposal is the government think it's a way too large. 2,000 billion euros or something like this. And then also there are lots of very difficult proposals which we anticipated. I think there was some amounting to some 500 billion euros of joint debt financed instruments. I think they were called the Crisis Instrument and the Catalyst EU or something like this. And these are basically just, I think you can say that this is just next Generation EU Volume 2, I think. So that's why, of course, our position in the Finnish government is very strictly negative. We will not accept this. And as you know, because the whole thing is based on unanimity in the end, due to the ratification process of the own resources decision. So even one member state can veto the whole thing in effect. So this is very strict position from us. Then there were, I'm focusing on the own resources proposal, although I would like to say that my personal view is that it's in a way, it's always more important to think about where the money is spent, and then it's only secondary how it's financed in a way, but this is just my take. I have a background as an economist. It might affect this position as well. Nevertheless, the Commission proposes, I think, 5 new own resources sort of instruments, and this is actually very important sort of fundamental political question, because these are, in effect, these are new taxes, and this influences and affects the sort of allocation, how money is collected from various member states. This is a big political issue, of course, and as you know, according to the treaties and the primary legislation of the Union, economic policy competence resides fully within member states, not the Union. It's not shared competence. So this means that tax policy, when we adopt various directives in the EU, of course we have unanimity because of this. And this is the same thing that now what the EU has done for the last 20 years, since the Euro crisis at least, it has been the fact that the EU has utilized sort of a salami tactic, so that they're trying to force a federal union without amending and opening the treaties. And this is fundamentally problematic, because this is not the democratic way to sort of go forward. If we want to have a federation of states, which we probably won't, then we should open the treaties and convene the Intergovernmental Convent. So this is the basic sort of aspect as regards to the proposal. The most difficult proposal within the own resources proposal was probably the corporate levy, which is kind of a it's just corporate taxation for large companies, and this is in the core of tax policy business. So it's quite weird that the Commission is intervening into sort of fundamental tax policy issues via using this proposal, which is to collect financial resources for the Union. So we shall see what will happen. I think that the negotiations will be quite tricky until 2027, summer, spring, whatever, when we have finally an agreement among the member states and the Parliament. But then, just to give you some ideas what we're talking about. I mean, first of all, as I said, it's always important to think what we spend actually the money on, and this is sort of, I mean, there are some things, some principles which are sort of good, at least I think. I mean, you could imagine some actually places where you can put money to, which could be beneficial for the member states and which could be beneficial to do at the level of the EU. And this is of course has to do with the principle of subsidiarity. So most of the stuff should be done at the level of the member states, including economic policy. But for example, when it comes to external borders and things like these, there might be some European public goods in a way that it might be more efficient to spend at the level of the EU. But these things are quite rare, I think. Nevertheless, I think that the problem is, as we in the previous panel, we discussed already that defense spending is going up. This is a fact, and also social spending in member states due to demographics. So this means that public finances are quite strained already without considering the EU at all. For example, in Finland now we have a pretty hard situation in public financing. We're actually entering the EDP, the excessive deficit procedure, next week, I think. So we have lots of trouble there. And then on top of this, we have the new strain coming from the EU, because as you know, the next generation EU instrument must be paid back. And then we have already taken up new joint debt when it comes to SAFE, at least Ukraine. these kinds of things. There are hundreds of billions of euros, and this needs to be paid back unless we roll it over indefinitely, which is not what we have agreed, at least when it comes to the next generation EU, because then it was agreed that this thing will be paid back in due time. But now it seems that Commission thinks a bit otherwise, I think, and we are going into the direction that we sort of need to spend more. The Commission thinks we need to spend more, and then on top of this, we need to basically at least have some money, some resources for paying back and buying back the bonds. So this is a problem, of course. And when it comes, it's not only actually when I said that the new own resources proposal is intervening in the field of tax policy, but the whole MFF proposal is very problematic because there's also this acronym. I don't know whether you have heard of it, but it's called the, because there are students here, I understood, National and Regional Partnership Plans, or NRPP. This is a very dangerous instrument because this basically gives member states money if and only if the money and the economic policy are tied to country-specific recommendations of the European semester. And this, in effect, takes the economic policy competence from the member states at the level of the EU. And this is not done via a sort of legally prudent way, but this is just sort of a de facto transfer of powers. And this is very dangerous, I think, because in the future, we can see a development where member states won't get money from these new programs within the MFF unless it complies with the country-specific recommendations. And this is very dangerous. This is just a bit beside the point as I'm trying to focus on the own resources, but just I couldn't help myself to bring up this point. So I think the question is, when it comes to own resources, is that just to summarize my initial take, is that own resources should be first and foremost a way to finance EU spending once the decision makers have decided what we spend on and how much. And that was the sort of philosophy. As you know, most of the money is collected via the gross-national income factor, which is majority of the money. This means that it's just a mechanistic calculation, and then basically the European Commission sends the bill to the capitals, I think 4 times a year or whatever. Now, with this new proposal and the new MFF, the own resources decision is effectively becoming a tax policy instrument. Not only because there is the sort of the so-called core instrument, which is the corporate tax levy, but then there's also a duty on tobacco, I think. Then there's a new instrument for electronic waste. Then there's the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And then there's also the emissions trading scheme and the volume 2 as well, I guess, in the future. So these are basically taxes from an economic point of view, and it affects the allocation which countries will pay. And I think this is a kind of a dangerous development because this should not be done like this. I think my personal preference would be that we would have just a basically very simple mechanistic way to calculate the contributions of member states. One final point, if you may, Mr. Chair. It's also actually quite interesting that we have taken this gross-national income-based own resource as a kind of a rule fixed in heaven or whatever. But if you think about it, it's quite interesting that gross-national income as an indicator or measure, it doesn't take into account, for example, how much the country is in debt. And this is kind of an issue I think the Commission will propose, not this time, but in 7 years' time. I think the next resource decision proposal will include some adjustment to this. So those countries who have lots of debt will probably pay less. That's my guess. Thank you.
Thanks, Jussi. You mentioned that as an economist you're more perhaps focused on what we spend the money on rather than how we raise that money. But I'm afraid I'm not going to let you get away that easily. You talked about those 5 proposals that have been floated for own resources. Which of them ring alarm bells from the perspective, let's say, of competitiveness, which is what Bogdan was talking about at the start, from the Finnish government's point of view?
Well, I think the most difficult, obviously, is the core proposal, which is the corporate levy for big companies, because, I mean, this, of course, affects the competitiveness of big companies in Europe, obviously. So this is something the government has already said officially no to. So this, Finland, the CBAM, from an economic point of view, it's less difficult as in a way it's a kind of a custom tariff, if you will. Then the other, well, tobacco, in principle, not the worst, I guess, and the e-waste, not the worst. But these are just the official views of my government, not personal views. So these are negotiable. Let's put it in this way. But the corporate tax levy is a no-go. Thanks.
Thanks, Jussi. Let's move to our next panelist now, Roald Dom from Bruegel. It's important that, as well as the political insights we've had, that we have input from academia, intellectual, data-driven, research-guided inputs, and Roald is here to give us that. So the floor is over to you, Roald.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the invitation. I think this may become an issue of 3 economists, 4 opinions on the panel, which may be good. But let me start by saying that I'm also generally quite skeptical of looking for new taxes. I think if you look across Europe and you look at tax ratios, you can't help but conclude that they're already quite high in many places. But still, I do think there is a tension that we are seeing where we are increasingly agreeing on new additional common priorities, climate, competitiveness, security, but the revenue architecture is not aligned with that. And if we think about that revenue architecture, then I think there's broadly 3 points. The first one is, and it's already been mentioned also on the previous panel, that there's no such thing as free money, right? Whether we raise revenue through national contributions or via new own resources, ultimately it's always, of course, European taxpayers, businesses, or citizens ending up paying for that. Moreover, if you look at the budget, if you don't increase the budgetary ceiling, then any new own resource will just shift the distribution of the burden across countries and not generate extra or new cash. And that's why I think it's important, or it's not a question of coming up with new taxes. I think that's probably the easy thing to do. Academics, pundits, also policymakers don't find it hard to propose new taxes. I think the harder thing to do is to figure out a way in which we align that revenue structure with the European public goods and the European goals that we have. Brings me to a second point, and I think if that's the case, then I think we need to be careful with proposals that look simple, but that are highly symbolic and may actually be economically very messy. And I tend to agree with the previous speaker that, for example, the core proposal doesn't match those conditions. I'm not expressing myself on the legal side, but from the economic side, as Bruegel, or through Bruegel, we published an analysis of the proposal in which we argue that it's actually economically quite distortionary. Moreover, it's also unfair in a way because the levy is because the fee is levied on turnover. It doesn't distinguish between, for example, high and low margin companies, and therefore it doesn't take into account, for example, the ability to pay of those companies. Brings me to my final point. That doesn't mean, or to me at least, that doesn't mean that there is no room for new own resources. I do think there is space and a necessity, but I think it's important in thinking about a new own resource that is aligned with the objectives that as a European Union we want to achieve, and that in designing that, we think about the distortions, but also the incentive effects. So coming to the conclusion, I would say I'm here with a pragmatic message. It's not about new taxes, but it's more about finding a way to align that revenue architecture with spending priorities.
Thanks very much, Roel. Well, Jussi mentioned tobacco levies as one source of own resources, and yet the European Union, the European Commission, is trying to stop smoking and trying to eradicate tobacco consumption, essentially. If we look at climate-related levies, the European Commission is also seeking to vastly reduce emissions across Europe. So is there not a fundamental mismatch between putting these structures in place and the policy elements that are actually effectively leading to a decline in those revenues?
That's a very pertinent question. And yes, there is a risk now. And I don't think, as with all behavioral taxes, there's obviously a trade-off between the incentive effect and the revenue effect that's at play. Now, for the climate levies, in particular CBAM and ETS, in the long term, but in the long term we're all dead, the revenue effect will or should be zero, because then everyone will have adjusted their economies. We will hopefully live in a climate stable environment and there will be no revenue from those instruments. Now, that's the long term. Or is that a feasible trajectory over the course of the next MFF? That I don't think so. I think, and we did that analysis in a blueprint that we published on the MFF just before the summer. Over the course of the next MFF, it's likely that there will be substantial revenue from these instruments still. Now, I do think it is important to make sure that new instruments indeed contribute to European public goods, and that requires defining what those European public goods are. Economic theory talks about non-rivalry and non-excludability public goods, so that means that your consumption of the good doesn't mean that someone else doesn't get to consume it, and you can't exclude me from consuming that product. But there's an additional element, which is, of course, should it be at the European level? There, I think you can talk about scale, externalities, common preferences, and I do think that the climate levies do fit that picture of an EU public good. Tobacco taxation might be more questionable whether that's a pure EU public good. That is definitely a public good, but is it European? That's another question from an economic perspective. I think what we also put forward in our work is that this principle, and we illustrated it with a proposal for a levy on defense shortfall spending, meaning that if countries are not spending as much as a certain target on defense, then you may want to think about levying something on that shortfall. That would give you the incentive effect, it would bring in revenue, and you would also, and I think that's important, you would shift a bit of the conversation away from how much am I paying, how much am I getting back, to a discussion about who is underperforming and in what way are we underperforming on some of these common objectives.
Great, thank you very much, Roel from Bruegel. Now, moving on to our third panelist, Professor Tomasz Grossa is Professor of Political Science and Sociology at the University of Warsaw, and his research is dealing fundamentally with EU institutional dynamics and questions of sovereignty, which is, of course, meat and drink, as we say, to the ECR group. So, Professor, the floor is yours.
First of all, thank you very much for invitation to that interesting conference. When I accepted that invitation, the first question I wanted to ask was what the conservative approach to the multi-annual financial framework should be. So what is some kind of combination among political values, conservative political values, and European financial system and the EU budget. First of all, conservative approach rejects centralization, which is supporting the transfer to the EU of national powers without appropriate legitimization or authorization of that process, which is called a competence creep in political science, and was also mentioned to some extent by my Finnish colleague. Conservative approach as well rejects so-called fiscal federalism, which is related, for instance, to next common debt proposed by the European Commission, and also to the so-called own fiscal capacity or resources created on the European level. So basically, we should reject or we should refuse any new European revenue or own resources proposed by the European Commission, even including some bigger amount of European customs or duties or present taxation. So, because it is against conservative point of view how European finances should be created or put in place. Secondly, it is highly important for our perspective to create a decentralized system and with some attention to subsidiarity principle, which means in practice that not European Commission decides about major criteria or principles, but the basic decision-making procedure is taking place on the national level. So, and finally, the idea of European integration from the perspective of conservative grouping should be based on development of common market without any additional powers transferred to the EU. So the common market basically is the root of our perspective of regional integration. And this means, in practice, that common market are a quite successful project in the EU should be supported by particularly cohesion policy, which compensate distortion of common market to the detriment of weaker states and regions. So it is a highly important fiscal measure to appropriate functioning of common market. So if we think about European budget from a conservative perspective, we should limit our multinational financial framework, in fact, only to common market, to cohesion policy, with maybe one exception to common agricultural policy, which is highly important from the food security. Is agricultural sector is under huge pressure from Mercosur deal, from Ukraine side. So we have many challenges related basically to current stage of geopolitical affairs, which means that we should further support common agriculture policy. So basically, my conclusion is that we should focus on cohesion policy and common agriculture policy. It's a highly conservative point of view, I know. We have some ideas to support competitiveness in the EU, defense policy, bearing in mind Moscow challenge to the EU security. I agree, and I think that both of those highly important priorities should be included in cohesion policy. And cohesion policy division among priorities should be decided on a national level. National governments plus parliaments should decide if they want to develop regional assistance, social programs, health sector, or maybe some important strategic infrastructure, or maybe defense projects, or support for competitiveness of local and national industries, etc. So it should be left to the national level, that kind of decision. So my last comment is that basically we should reject any new European own resources discussed, for instance, by predecessors. Secondly, the new common European debt, because those proposals simply support so-called fiscal federalism. And finally, we should also reject political conditionality, because it strengthens centralization and European Commission power over democratic national governments, and the verdict of local or national electorates, what kind of government they want. And we have a highly difficult experience in Poland when, because of conservative approach of Polish previous government, it was punished by the European Commission, and all European funding was suspended because of political conservative approach of that government. So it is, to my mind at least, no rule of law problem. We have the same problems with respecting the rule of law, treaty law, for instance, by European Commission. So it is not that matter or that issue. It is pure arbitrary decision by European Commission on political matters, which is highly important strengthening of European Commission powers over European finances and national democracies. So rejection of conditionality mechanism is highly important from my point of view, and I think from the conservative grouping, because conservatives or conservative governments would be punished in the next multinational financial framework. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. We have to move now to a fourth panelist who's joining us from Italy, Professor Domenico Lombardi from LUIS. Professor, I believe you're online waiting for us. Could I please ask you to speak in English, because for reasons I'm not quite sure of, I'm told that we don't have interpretation for your remarks. Thank you. We don't hear you, Professor. Could you just unmute yourself, please? I think we're just dealing with the technical link. We can hear you.
Hello, Mr. Jones. Yes, sorry for the technical issue, so I can hear you, and so I hope you can hear me as well. So first of all, thank you very much to the organizer for the invite. Apologies for not attending in person. And I've been following the interventions of previous speakers, and I just want to emphasize, a few comments I have on the forthcoming MFF from a conservative perspective. I think the basic premise is what we have already heard. There is increasing demand for EU policies, EU interventions, from security to competitiveness to collective defense, and yet resources at the European level, at the EU level, are constrained. So I think as conservatives should put a greater emphasis on the credibility of the MFF, in particular on demonstrating effective and efficient use of resources. And how can you demonstrate this effective and efficient use of resources? I think, first of all, by sort of addressing the current fragmentation of the performance framework. Clearly, when indicators and evaluation frameworks differ substantially across policy areas, comparing progress across different programs becomes nearly impossible, and we lose efficiency and effectiveness. And then promote a closer integration between audit and evaluation. And in particular, when we talk about evaluation, that means not just simply looking at monitoring compliance and error rates, but also enable evaluations to feedback into the project design and drive the necessary policy adjustments. And I would say, as a corollary to that, we also need to strengthen, evaluation units, the evaluation culture within the EU institutions. And so I think, we should really shift the focus from a more retrospective ex post reporting to a more ex ante midterm assessments to allow for real-time course corrections, ensuring that the budget is a dynamic instrument, not just a static plan. And I think this would go a long way in terms of ensuring greater efficiency and effectiveness of how resources are going to be employed. So I don't have, I don't know if you have questions. I'm, of course, at your disposal in case there is any follow-up on my comments.
Thank you, Professor. Domenico Lombardi from Luis in beautiful Rome, where the ECR group met for study days just last month. Indeed, there may well be some questions from the floor, so I'd like to invite anyone who'd like to comment, particularly on the issue of own resources, to take the floor. Maybe our panelists even have comments on each other's remarks. Mrs. Zalewska, please.
Thank you. I will speak Polish. Bardzo dziękuję za...
Well, thank you very much for your very interesting presentations. Now we are talking about own resources, so I want to draw your attention to the fact that it seems we missed two elements. We talked about taking away fiscal competencies from member states. Now, 25-30% of ETS from national budgets. ETS revenue to national budgets by decision by the Commission will be taken away. So this is in a dire breach of the principle of self-determination. So as of 2026, even now, such competencies have already been abused because the Commission is defining ETS-related revenue. I don't know if you remember that until recently, 50% of such revenue should be spent on energy transformation. Now it is 100% and not should be spent, but has to be spent. So the Commission has taken far-reaching decisions as to how money in member states' budgets is to be spent. Also, ETS2 has disappeared miraculously. ETS2 is nowhere to be seen in the EU budget, but we have this new EU Environmental Justice Fund. Because the idea was that we would take money from the ETS system and 1/4 would be spent on this environmental fairness fund. But ETS2 and the preliminary ETS2 revenue now is seen in national environment and energy plans, which is a document which is to illustrate what is going to be done with CO2 emission cuts. So this shows how intransparent or illusory this whole idea is for multi-annual financial framework, and it shows how much of this multi-annual budget is based on own resources for which there are no legal basis. So we can assume that as many as 600 billion euro we will get from somewhere. We will decide, yes, it's going to be 600 billion, and only later, only after, will we decide where to take that money from. How to adapt EU laws and regulations in order to allow creation of such a strange budget. So can you comment on this, please?
Thank you, Mrs. Zalewska. Who would like to comment on that? Jussi first.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for the comment. Indeed, I think this is the sort of, which also I think the professor referred to, that the key problem here is the sort of de facto transfer of powers from the capitals to Brussels. And whether it's ETS2, whether it's the NRPP, whether it's whatever, it's actually the same mechanism, and you can see the same mechanism in action already during the years of the Eurozone fiscal crisis, when de facto economic policy powers were transferred, for example, from Greece to Brussels and Washington and Frankfurt and so forth. So this is the same thing. I think this is something that everybody in this building should be very concerned of, because if the European Union sort of stresses that everything has to be based on rule of law, but it in itself doesn't obey the rule of law, because it basically circumvents the primary legislation of the Union, so it's going against the treaty. At least in spirit. And this, by the way, the same thing was with the common borrowing, because at least in Finland, when we were negotiating the next generation EU 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we had the same legal issue, because we were of the view that the instrument is not legal in the first place. But then the Commission came up and the Council Legal Services with an explanation, as always.
Thanks, Jussi. Would any of the other panelists like to comment on Mrs. Zalewska's observations? Professor.
First of all, it is a huge debate in Poland among opposition parties, right-wing conservative opposition parties, about suspension of ETS system in Poland by the next Polish government. So why we should discuss about any provision for the European Commission from that financial instrument that Polish conservatives simply want, as in other member states, I heard about Slovakia, for instance, simply to exclude the whole mechanism, or at least suspend that mechanism for a couple of years. So it is a quite obvious consequence that we shouldn't agree for any transfer for the European budget from that mechanism, any kind of sources. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Let's open the floor again just to see if anybody else has. Sebastian Tingen, MEP, please. Yes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the panelists for very interesting remarks. I don't care if the EU is introducing us a cigarette tax or meat tax or television tax or boat tax or whatever it's called, but I care about if they introduce us new tax. I would like to ask you, is this something innocent that EU is doing, that we just need more money and now we introduce you this new thing? Or do you see that there's actually behind some more purposeful strategy, that they want to widen their power to taxation that traditionally doesn't belong to the powers of the EU, like that they kind of try to get us, the member states, used to it, that EU collects different kind of taxes? Thank you very much.
So competence creep, which is what Professor Grosser called it, an interesting subject and one that has developed, one that has generated a great deal of controversy. Our panelists, please. Competence creep. Jussi.
Thanks. I think this is the essence, really. My understanding, based on 15 years of working in the Finnish civil service and 3 years for the Commission, I think there's a very coherent, implicit plan to instate a federal Europe, and we have clues. If you think about what constitutes a sort of primitive federal union, it needs to have a common army somehow. It needs to have a common tax office. It needs to have the ability to issue bonds on the capital market. And if you think about what's going on now, we have SAFE, financed by common issuance of bonds. We have new tax proposals within the ORD, the Own Resources Decision proposal. And basically, we are discussing more and more each day about the military capabilities of the EU. So these are all actually ways which are leading to a federal union of Europe. I mean, federal union for Europe could be okay for some countries. I'm not saying this. But if we are building a federal union, we should obey our primary legislation. So we should open up the treaties and see who's in and who's out. Thanks.
Roll.
Thanks, but I'm not sure the competence creep is the best way of framing this. I think more relevant to me as a public finance economist, the more relevant question is how do we deal with underfunding of things that we value as Europe? So the question then becomes, how can that be solved? How can we get in place the architecture, also on the revenue side, that supports achieving those goals? And I think whether it's about climate, as we spoke about before, security or competition, I think the fundamental logic, economic logic, remains the same. How do we deal with these common challenges, while at the same time minimizing the cost that is linked also to fragmentation, because we have to be honest, there is a cost to fragmentation. So how do we balance those? And I think once you start thinking about that, then you can think about the structure in the revenue system that supports those objectives in the most, from an economic side, most efficient way. And that, at least to me, suggests a distinction between the desirability of ETS CBAM on the one hand and perhaps a core levy on the other hand. How you then spend it and the legal side of that, that's, I think, a separate question. But at least from the economic side, I think that's, to me, a more useful way of framing it in the sense, how do we overcome that collective action challenge that we face on a number of these challenges?
Okay, Jack, please.
Good morning. My name is Jacek Kurski. I am advisor for ECR Group in the European Parliament, but 2 years ago I was the member of the executive directors of the World Bank Group in Washington, D.C. I am mentioning about it to attract your attention to some American experience. I mean, something which is in common wisdom mentioned and remembered as Hamiltonian moment. As you remember, Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of Treasury, one of the founders of the United States, took over and assumed the state's debts for the sake of the government to create and to accelerate the building of the United States of America. It worked. It worked. As a result, the biggest democracy and the strongest economy in the world was created. But what we are witnessing in Europe is looking something like caricature of the Hamiltonian moment, because ineffective European elites, especially European Commission, pushed through and imposed absurd idea of joint debts for the European countries, allegedly to repair European economy affected after COVID-19 pandemic, but primarily, in fact, to accelerate the building of centralized superstate, from which there will be no way, no escape, no rescue, because of the European jointly debts. How political the decision was is clearly illustrated by my own country, by Poland. Professor Grosse has already mentioned about it. First, funds from the National Recovery Plan were blocked to kick out the conservative government of Law and Justice, and now replaced by the left liberal government of Platforma Obywatelska. Now government is abandoning significant parts of both loans and grants of the project of the European Recovery Plan, citing as a reason lack of national co-financing. It's crazy because we pay cost and we have no income from that. My question is, do you share this approach, or if you share, is it possible to ever walk away from this madness idea of joint debts for the European Union? How do you think of it? Thank you.
Is it possible to walk away, or is this permanent? Jussi.
This is an excellent question again. I think this EU is in some sort of a gridlock. We cannot really move forward, but we cannot go back. Honestly, I don't know what will happen. My best guess is that there will be a huge crisis of some sort, and then something will happen to the either or direction. Either the thing will collapse on itself, or then we will have a federal union. This sort of union as we now have, this will not work for long. The next financial crisis, when it comes, and surely it will come, things will change. As for the Hamiltonian moment, I actually written a book about this theme in Finland. It's only in Finnish, unfortunately, but this is indeed the case, and there are further clues that this is happening. If you think about the narrative and discussion on the international reserve currency, so
strengthening the international role of the euro. This has been the agenda for the Commission for years. This means basically that we try to somehow be a real competitor to the US dollar. This demands, of course, by the various economic theory results from 1960s already, that we need, actually by a Belgian economist. So it requires, the reserve currency requires a huge amount of basically safe assets, which is technically, I guess, true, but this means that we only have safe assets, I guess, German bonds and the EU bonds are safe, and then the central bank deposits. So this is one clue. The other clue is that you should take a look on what happens in capital regulations of banks, because I think there's also a tendency there that the national bonds, so for example the government bonds of Finland, they will get in future a worse capital treatment in prudential regulation of banks than EU bonds. I think the idea is to make the EU bonds risk-free with zero risk weights in capital treatments, prudential treatment of banks, and then punish the national debt. This could be also the same idea when it comes to the ECB, the European Central Bank. Now that we witnessed for 10 years quantitative easing, it's been done by pro rata for the Eurozone government bonds. But in future, I guess at least some people in Brussels and in Frankfurt dream of a system where quantitative easing would be done purely by buying EU bonds, not national bonds. This would replicate actually technically the true Hamiltonian moment in a way, because in the US, according to my understanding, the Federal Reserve is not allowed to buy state bonds. It will only buy federal bonds, so US treasuries. And this is what the EU, at least some people in here and in Frankfurt, are thriving for. Of course, I'm not for this development. I don't think it will happen in 5 years. I think it will take a huge crisis which will move things forward. But to be honest, I don't know whether we will move forward or backward. I just don't know.
Thank you, Jussi. Nice to have a little bit of optimism at the end. Any of the other panelists who want to contribute to this particular question from Jack Kurski? Ro?
Maybe just quickly that, again, the way I look at this is slightly from a different perspective. It's more in terms of what's the objective and what's the instrument. I guess if there is a decision to completely give up, and I'm not sure I completely agree that we've had that Hamiltonian moment completely, as the US has had it in the past. I think we're still not there yet. But suppose that we don't go for more joint debt, then we should also acknowledge that there is a cost to that in terms of our power, in what we can achieve in terms of achieving those common goals, European defense, climate, competition, and so on. So we would be restricting ourselves in some ways as well, and I think that's an important element to acknowledge as well if we don't go for joint debt.
Thank you. Any other remarks from the floor before we conclude? Please.
Hello. I noticed a bit of tension between the panels. On the one hand, we are discussing the need for efficient investment in new technologies in defense. On the other hand, I hear we want to shrink the EU budget. We want to limit it to a little cohesion, a little agriculture. And I think another thing, you mentioned that you were talking a lot about these labels, taxpayer money, member state money, but these are things which are fluid. These are things which we decide not on the basis of what has been done, but on the basis of what should be done in the future. Now, we're conservatives, but we are also reformists, and we need to acknowledge that I think the real obstacle towards making Europe and Europeans richer is, I think, a lack of ambition at the moment. Things like more Eurobonds and a unified capital market are meaningful structural reforms which could make and spur greater investment in the European Union. And we must own up and face to this. If we do not make these difficult decisions, then we cannot move forward. And I think we can talk about and say, oh, okay, we're opposed to this because it's not the conservative approach, these things, but I think we should recognize above anything else that the world is changing. And as Heraclitus once said, in order for everything to stay the same, in order for everything beautiful to stay the same, everything must change. So are we ready to accept that meaningful treaty reform could open the pathway towards a richer Europe? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, if you think there's tension on the panel, wait until this is discussed in plenary. I think that's going to be carnage. Do any of the panelists, I mean, interesting point you also make, by the way, about this kind of concept of creative destruction, to keep things beautiful, having to deconstruct them and restart. But panelists, please, Professor.
First of all, I can see no tension between cohesion policy and innovation, competitiveness, defense funds, responding for all of those new challenges we face. So, because I proposed to include into cohesion policy all those targets, and I proposed to national governments, democratically elected, to choose what they prefer, to develop cohesion, internal cohesion in given member states, which means supporting for regional development programs, or preparing to deter Moscow and support domestic military industries, some military infrastructure, or maybe innovation, national innovation system, or competitiveness of domestic enterprises. So companies. So I think that including all of those priorities into cohesion envelopes, national cohesion envelopes, is from 2 points of view in accordance with conservative approach. First of all, because cohesion policies are response for liberal common market. It compensates some problems resulting for poorer regions and member states of the logic of liberal common market, which of course is detrimental to weaker part of the EU. Secondly, it is those member states which are weaker on the common market is protected by national envelopes. So we can see, for instance, development of defense capacities or competitiveness of domestic industries also in weaker part of the Europe, not only on western part, which is highly developed and more competitive than eastern part of the EU. So I also want to add that still fiscal federalism, including common debt, is not any response for our problems. From a very simple reason, because Europe is highly indebted. The Eurozone is at high risk because a huge public debt, even larger than before Eurozone crisis. So increasing common debt is not solution, it's a way to disaster. It's opening the gate to another financial crisis and collapse of the Eurozone. So my proposal is to rather support national finances, national democracies, national capacity to invest, which is in accordance with subsidiary principle than to support common joint European debt. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Jussi, very briefly, please.
Thanks. Just quickly, my own couple of thoughts. I think treaty change is inevitable. It's needed. It must be done, preferably sooner than later. My personal take is that at the European level, we should only basically finance European public goods. I mean, from a technical point of view, it makes sense. So, I don't know, some cross-member state infrastructure maybe, external border maybe, things like this. In the future, I would guess that things like cohesion, you might think of cohesion that it's good or bad, but I think that its role will diminish in the future, as it should, because it's not a permanent thing. It's not supposed to be a permanent thing. When it comes to the joint debt, I agree with the professor here that I don't think it's a solution because, I mean, what matters is spending. That's my whole point.
Thanks, Jussi. I'm afraid we're going to have to round things off now. Unfortunately, our vice coordinator in the Budgets Committee, Mr. Ruggero Razza, is unable to connect properly. And so I'm going to pass the floor to the inspiration behind this very interesting and thought-provoking event, Bogdan Johnsa, to round off, please.
Generally, thank you all participants for present now, and also everyone who watching our debate remotely. And short conclusion. Would be better I said it's to Polish. No tak. Wygląda.
Indeed, it seems that the European Union is no longer Santa Claus with its huge bag of limitless gifts. It's true, we know that now. But we wonder whether or not the EU has not actually arrived to the limit of its spending possibilities. We do hope that nothing major happens in Europe or across the world, but we've already seen some signs how helpless EU was when the war broke, for instance, in Ukraine. We were far from fast action then. Unfortunately, crisis does not show how strong we are, shows how weak we are. We all know there is hardly ever enough to cover all needs. We just heard that there is additional 45 billion for farmers. Just like that, out of the blue, suddenly 45 billion brought by Madame von der Leyen, saying that maybe this will calm down the whole demonstration situation, and maybe Mercosur will go through because we have the additional 45 billion, which actually comes from our taxpayers' money. We see a huge problem related to that. When it comes to future debt now, despite catastrophic situation in the EU, we keep on adding new, very costly policies, priorities to the list already existing without reflection on where we will take the monies from. And I think one of those is actually decarbonization. Someone said that in the room. Very costly target. And I think many businesses across Europe would agree that it kills off entrepreneurship across Europe because of high energy bills. Also, we've heard that some of the policies work very well, some of them don't work at all. What we would need is a major review of how EU works, where it works well and where it wastes money. I think what we've learned today also is that the way the EU works lacks transparency, lacks efficiency. This has been already mentioned by the European Court of Auditors. This is just one of the few examples, and maybe what we should do is to have another think about the own resources, new own resources. We discussed this also today, and we know that in some of the list of priorities, part of the list of priorities is not covered by appropriate commitments, funds. So very often we have meetings where people get enthusiastic and discuss new wonderful objectives that the EU is supposed to meet. But on the other hand, we have a group of economists who say, okay, but where will you find the money to cover the cost of meeting these objectives? Current financial framework up to 2028, this is something we produced back in 2020, 2021. But then 22 happened, 24, 25, and I think what we lacked was a certain reflection on what happened, what has happened. For instance, the war in Ukraine or the pandemic. So maybe we should have started cutting certain expenses already then, and we should have redirected the money to address real problems. We failed at that. I think that our budget functions as if in the past 5 years, nothing has happened in Europe, nothing negative. Again, I'm quoting the pandemic or the war in Ukraine. We all know what this mistake is and what it costs us, but we have to have the majority in the parliament to make it all work. But our guests today very often mentioned the issue of rolling over the debt from this year to the years going forward. It's not a solution. We also are facing competition from China, India, and we might end up in a very difficult situation. What the European Commission is doing, completely spaced out in a way, completely detached from other institutions, is not right. We, as the European Parliament, are the only institution representing directly elected representatives of EU citizens. But unfortunately, it's us who get the beating when something goes wrong, not the commissioners who go around Europe very rarely. It's us, because we have to face the voters and we have to listen how they complain about rising energy bills, for instance, and bleak prospects. Let's look at the situation with food, for instance, security. Also, the food being imported from Ukraine and Latin America. If New Deal is done with India, for instance, also on food, if you put this all together, then maybe it will become obvious that we are destroying one of the most successful policies of the EU, which is the CAP. For years, we were thinking through CAP about food security for our citizens. I do hope that what we have heard here today, the debate that we have had today, will constitute in a way a wake-up call for many of us. Ourselves, our guests, but also the young people, students. I hope that, of course, the EU will be quoted as a very important and valuable project that makes sense. However, unfortunately, at this time and age, it's really badly managed. Thank you.
Thank you, Bogdan. And as I suggested to our last questioner there, this is messy and it's only going to get messier. But I think the ECR's role is clear to inject a sense of strategic clarity and political reality into this discussion. So briefly, thanks to our technical colleagues, to our interpreters in 5 languages for your excellent work, to our panelists, please stay behind for a photo if you wouldn't mind. And briefly to thank the ECR team, Deputy Secretary General Andrea Cepova, Christina Bantelli, Natalia Brakovic, Jan van Brussel, Kamila Brzezinska, Massimo Tamble, Paola Graziano, and our interns Paolo, Cristiano, and Johan.
And Stefan John.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Thank you. I know economists have a saying, which is one of my favourites, there's no such thing as a free lunch. But free lunch, or if I have to pay, it's time for lunch. So with that, I will say thank you very much for coming. Let's continue this debate in the coming months.